Thanks for joining me again for Connected Marriage. The general idea for this series is that marriage is a lot like a household appliance, a vacuum cleaner, for example, that if not connected to a source of power outside of itself, it will not function correctly and will only produce frustration. So is marriage, that God designed us married couples to function only in connection with a power source outside of ourselves, namely God Himself. That's why we hope to introduce practical truths from Scripture that will move us toward God and one toward another. We're using the word power as an acrostic in these lessons to remind us of this truth about connection. The P in the word power was represented by the previous lesson that we looked at a week ago, pardon. We must receive and give pardon. Well, today, as we enter into the second lesson together, the letter O is represented by the concept of ownership. It's time to stop coasting in our marriage and take ownership of our relationship again. Before we move on to today's material, let's maintain our accountability and let's check the homework assignments from the previous lesson, which first of all, number one, was to keep a list of previous offenses that each spouse had committed and for which you both had to ask your spouse for forgiveness for. The second homework assignment was this, to write the definition of forgiveness on a 3x5 card to carry around with you this week. Thirdly, both spouses were to find a Bible verse about forgiveness, either God's forgiveness or our forgiveness. Also write it on a 3x5 card, memorize the verse, and have it ready to recite to your spouse before the beginning of today's lesson. Hope you did that one. Finally, as a couple, you are to set aside a time for honest discussion about each one's failures in marriage and to engage in humble confession and forgiveness with one another. How did you both fare on those individual assignments, and did you have a time of heart-to-heart confession and forgiveness with God and one another? I hope that these assignments were very applicable and enriched your relationship. If you need to pause the video and talk to each other concerning these assignments for any reason, please do. Don't worry, I'm a virtual counselor and I have a whole lot of time to wait for you. Well, let's consider today's lesson on ownership. As in all of our lessons, I'd like to make you aware of the goals at the top of page 1 that we have so that when we conclude today's lesson, both the husband and the wife, number one, will appreciate God's design of his or her marriage as the relationship that quenches our thirst for connection with another person at the deepest level, and may both spouses see the exceeding value of their marriage above any other relationship or friendship that they might have. Number two, secondly, that both of you will own your marriage by eliminating any competing factors that interfere with your marriage connection. Our third goal is that the husband and the wife will put passivity aside and begin to actively own your marriage relationship by making daily investments in your spouse. And finally, that both of you will be made aware of the grave effect that a divorce would have upon your children if indeed you do have children. Let's move on to today's content. I'd like to begin by illustrating the importance of marriage and ownership for you. For example, for a packet of gum or a ballpoint pen, we don't go so far as using titles and deeds to prove that they belong to us. These lesser value items don't carry the importance for us that would necessitate a proof of ownership, because if we lost them, it wouldn't be so difficult to go and obtain another one. But for our more valuable possessions, for example, such as a plot of land or an automobile, we do use deeds and titles to protect ourselves from others who might unjustly attempt to claim or steal them. For example, if our neighbor were to start building a shed on our side of the property, declaring the land for himself, there's little doubt that we would present our proofs of ownership in court to prevent him from using the land for himself. Our vehicles, for their value, come with titles as well. And if a thief were to break into our car, hotwire it, and drive it away, we would be quite zealous to recover it. And upon the recovery of our beloved automobile, we would present firmly the title with our name upon it as the proof that the car belongs to us. Well, our marriage has a title also, the marriage license, giving legal proof that it's ours. Why? Because marriage is of great value. And in contrast, we don't have licenses for our casual friendships and acquaintances because they simply don't carry the weight of the sacred pact of marriage. But unfortunately, over time, it's possible that we have allowed intruders to influence us, and we've relinquished pieces of our marriage to other people. Perhaps some type of internet romance on social media or nosy family member has intervened by our permission, and we've lost our way and are in danger of losing our marriage. And yet, though we'd be so anxious to recover a stolen automobile, sometimes weeks, months, and even years go on, and we passively observe as others claim pieces of our marriage that don't belong to them. Well, it's time to take back what is ours, our marriage. It's time to stop coasting and to start owning. We must take ownership. Let's consider for this lesson the definition of ownership, and it's found there on page 1 of your lesson. Ownership is this: the legal exclusive right of possession or proprietorship. Next in our lesson is the key passage, which is Proverbs 5:15 through 19. Let me read that for us, but as I read it to you, please observe the emphasis upon ownership. The language in the text is couched in the possessive terms. Thine own cistern, thine own well, thy fountains, let them only be thine own. Here are Solomon's wise words concerning marriage. Drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of water in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and as the pleasant roe. Let her breasts satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. Today's counseling session on ownership will be an exposition of this text. In this passage, wise Solomon compares the marriage relationship with a cistern, a well of deep water, a very precious commodity in ancient times. Tribes often fought over such cisterns because of their excellent value. These wells of water were prized because of investment. A man would give much time and energy to digging and eventually finding water springing up from within the earth. They were also valuable because of their provision. The well's owner could return to it and quench his own thirst and the thirst of his family members and livestock. And because of their immense worth in the arid Middle East of the biblical context, no one would easily relinquish his wells of water to others. The spiritual point here is this: that marriage is a deep relationship, one that we've invested much into, designed by God to quench our thirst for love and connection with another person. Our marriage is our cistern that we must zealously own. And in a world where pornography, adultery, and resulting divorces are so prevalent, we must protect our well of water because God is a good God. He instructs us on how to do exactly that. Well, let's look at the marriage applications from the text section at the bottom of page 1. The first one there says this: invigorate your marriage by rehashing the great memories that you have had together over the years. Please write the word memories in the blank for this point. And this application comes from Proverbs chapter 5 verse 15, where we read these words: drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Here's a very simple application for your relationship as husband and wife in this text. The reality is this: that you have a well of water that belongs to you. It's yours and nobody else's. When you thirst for emotional and physical intimacy, therefore, you ought to return to your own well, your spouse. Those deep waters are there for you, and your love is profound. And with no one else on earth do you have such a wonderful relationship filled with so many memories, not with your own parents, siblings, or even children. No one has experienced with you what your spouse has experienced. Many memories abound. The first time you caught one another's eye, that nervous first date, the breathtaking engagement day, and of course, the wonderful wedding itself where you vowed until death do us part. These are romantic milestones that are very beneficial to revisit often. Talk about them, relive them. Such memories are fresh water for thirsty hearts and motivate us to create new memories together and more romance one with another. The second point under marriage applications from the text is this: to consider the grave impact that a divorce would have upon your children. Go ahead and fill in the space with the word impact. It comes from verse 16, where we read these words: let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of water in the streets. The application here is that if you have children together, they are part of that blessed cistern, the product of your union as a married couple. They are waters produced within your well, useful waters to be sent forth for the benefit of society, as Solomon states, to be dispersed abroad. The success of children is an inherent desire in parents, but also inherent is that the breakup of their parents is a tremendous threat to their success. In the context here of Proverbs chapter 5, where Solomon describes the need to own and strengthen our marriage, he mentions our children as well, because there's nothing that poses a greater threat to a child's emotional and spiritual security than instability in his parents' marriage. Not the uncertainty of puberty, not an economic challenge in the home, nor even the loss of a friend. A child's greatest fear is that his parents are at odds with each other. And of course, to this tension, they're not ignorant. They can sense the cold silence. They hear the bitter arguments through the walls. And the concern of their parents' divorce shakes them emotionally, since mom and dad's togetherness is their whole world. And while children aren't primarily the glue that ought to hold a marriage together, and staying in it for the kids' sake isn't necessarily the best motive for marriage, it's certainly part of the equation. You know, children don't choose to have unfaithful or embittered parents, but children are forced to live with the consequences if their parents' marriage dissolves. Consider your children as you work with your spouse. And really, one of the greatest gifts that you can give as parents to your children is not the latest iPhone or gaming system, but to deeply love your spouse. There's enough uncertainty in their lives as children and teenagers, and they don't need your rocky relationship to add to the equation. So why not humble ourselves? And in doing so, you will also show your children not just emotional security that they can have, but a biblical marriage model for them to observe and live out in their own future marriage. And if God hasn't given you children yet, your marriage is being observed by children, perhaps at church and even in your own neighborhood, or by your nieces and nephews. People young and old alike are watching to see if your marriage is worth emulating. Ask yourselves the question, is it worth emulating? The third point in this section is this: eliminate any form of competition or outside interference. In the first blank, fill in the word competition, and in the second blank, the last word of that sentence there, please put the word interference. And as you write down those, I will read the verse from which we get this application. It's Proverbs 5:17. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Allow me to explain this truth and apply it to us. The text implies that when one has been careless with his cistern, he has neglected investing in the marriage relationship, there's a great risk that his or her spouse might seek social, emotional, or even physical intimacy with someone else. Therefore, God warns us to pay close attention to our spouse. By meeting the needs of your mate, you'll be ensuring that you and your spouse will not go looking elsewhere for love. Let them be only thine own. Own your marriage. It belongs to you and no one else. Not to an ex, not to a secretary at work, not to an internet fling or a neighbor, not strangers with thee, as Solomon says. And for men, this means that you must steadily romance your wife. Engage with her in deep conversation. Compliment her physical beauty often. Verbally remind her of your love. Shut off the TV or the device when she goes to bed, and lead her into your bedroom to connect with her spiritually, emotionally, and intimately. You must regularly engage in this responsible behavior to eliminate any form of competition. And for the wives, this means that you yield to your husband in unconditional respect. Prepare him delicious meals. Thank him for working hard. Speak of him in an honorable way, especially before your children, and recognize that his sex drive can only be satisfied righteously through an intimate relationship with you. Meet those needs regularly. Your consistent intimacy with your husband protects him from the juggernaut of pornography, the allure of some Facebook romance, and in general the promiscuity of our culture. Allow him to run to you, his cistern, to enjoy those waters without guilt. And as a couple, it means also that you ought to not involve others when there's problems between you two. In an era when so many marriages have been wrecked by intervening family members and spouses who feel the need to get their marriage problems off their chest with anyone who will listen, we must learn to pray together, to communicate, and to resolve conflicts together. In doing so, you shield one another from the bitterness that ruins so many marriage relationships. Here's the next point, and it's a vital one in this lesson. May your thirst for connection and romance be satisfied only with your spouse. Please fill in the word connection in the first blank and the word romance in the second blank. This truth is derived from Proverbs 5:18, where we read these words from Solomon: "Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth." It's a fact. We are social creatures. We like to laugh with others, talk with others, and share life with others in general. God designed us to want a true and lasting romance with another. God knows our desire because God made us as such. In the Garden of Eden, God said these words, "It is not good for a man to be alone." God designed marriage to make up for our lack of closeness. He said right away, "I will make a helpmeet, a suitable helper for him." The wife is the answer to the loneliness of man. She supplements his need for romance. And some other woman besides our wife is not a cistern of fresh water, but a polluted, poisonous swamp. Therefore, a wife must cultivate a blessed, rejoicing attitude toward her husband, as the verse mentions, rather than having a critical, surly attitude toward him. Also, a husband must work to be more connected to his wife than to his co-worker or to his fishing buddy. You are made for connection with each other. Here's the next point under marriage applications from the text. Minister to one another through flirtatious affection. In that long blank there, two words should fit, and they are the words flirtatious affection. The application comes from Proverbs 5:19, where we read these words, "Let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe." This is a fascinating commandment coming from King Solomon. As a monarch in the ancient Middle East, he knew precisely the illustration that he wanted to give us here. Just off their courts, royal kings kept gazelles and deer because in the pressure-packed moments of making decisions for a nation, they would often steal away to these amiable creatures, pet them, and momentarily escape the pressures that monarchical life pounded upon them. The application here is this, that in a world full of tension and stress, a delightful woman with a pleasant attitude serves as a man's delicate refuge. Husbands must learn to steal away to their wives and be affectionate and pleasant toward them. Wives also must cultivate their inner beauty and be careful to project a positive, pleasant attitude rather than a pessimistic one that might drive her husband away from her. Also in the context, surely sex is a vital aspect of marriage, but it's not all. That flirtatious caressing, those warm embraces and deep stares into one another's eyes are so important as well. And women long for such endearment, and husbands therefore must consider this need and meet it constantly. And really, when a husband acts romantically only when he desires sexual intimacy, but he lacks showing daily affection, his wife feels more used instead of loved. Learn to laugh together, to flirt with one another, and to generally enjoy married life. You are one another's refuge. The final point in this section has two blanks to fill in. I'll read it for you so that you can be ready. Sexual intimacy ought to be constant and never sought from anyone other than your spouse. Here's the verse. "Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger?" With respect to sexual intimacy, the scriptural emphasis here is on consistency at all times, and the word always is found there. Physical romance should not be fleeting but persistent in our marriages. In 1 Corinthians 7:5, we see the same principle as well. "Defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency." God designed sexual intimacy in marriage to protect both partners from the prevalent evil of infidelity. Since sexual temptation is constant among us, so also should marital intimacy, God's designed refuge for sexual pleasure. Any significant pause, though, in this relationship must only be for spiritual fasting and not for resentment. It must be a mutual spiritual decision rather than a selfish carnal one. Sex should not be withheld as a punishment to a spouse or as a weapon to get what one might want in marriage. If it is not mutual, the temptation to adultery is greater and the marriage could be in grave danger. The devil's very astute. He tempts couples to have all kinds of sex before they get married, and then he tempts them to have no sex once they're married together. Don't fall for his temptations. Own your well. Own your waters. For husbands, this means to minister to your wife romantically, lovingly, patiently, seeking to please her in your intimate life. Seek her as your escape from a vicious world of sexual temptations. Allow yourself to be her escape from this vicious world as well. Let her know that after Christ, she reigns in your life and no one else is more important to you than her. For wives, the application is to not deny your husband sexual intimacy. You are God's vessel for his sanctity. He has a testosterone buildup that requires a release, and the only way in a good conscience that your husband can experience that release is through intimacy with you. The text implies that if you deny him such intimacy, he might be tempted to seek it elsewhere. elsewhere. Therefore, let you yourself be only his own. Let's go to the next page in our lesson and look at the connection questions at the top of page 2. Get ready to pause the video if you need to answer the questions. The first question is this: what words would you use to describe your emotional connection? Pleasant, strained, manipulative, sarcastic, joyful? How much time do you spend in meaningful conversation with each other every day, and why is it not more? You can fill in the boxes on your PDF as you answer these questions, and I encourage you to both answer the questions individually and then compare your answers and discuss them together. Really, only you two can answer these questions for your marriage, but may I offer some information that might provide betterment in this area for you? Recently, a group of divorce lawyers made a list of the most common factors that threaten marriages. And number one on that list in order of commonality was that screen time had replaced connection time as a couple. Guard yourselves from being just close physically but distant emotionally. Disconnect from the internet, from the apps, and even from the games, and make time daily for just you two together. Here's the second question: how do both sides need to change to engage one another emotionally? Going back to the previous lesson on forgiveness, are there some issues that you haven't dealt with and that you need to forgive one another for? Or perhaps it's something else. Maybe you as the wife, as a little girl, you were wounded by a distant father who ignored your emotional needs, and now as an adult, you're unfairly imposing your dad's conduct upon your husband, and so you live protecting yourself from an emotional connection because you simply don't want to get hurt by another man. Or perhaps you're the husband who gets home from work, eats his dinner, and promptly disappears. You know, I've seen guys who literally spend years tinkering with their dream car in the garage so that they can avoid the realities of married and family life. And what do you get from that? You get a car that doesn't work, and you get a marriage that doesn't work either. Maybe together both of you have allowed your home to be overly child-centric, and you haven't ordered your lives to connect with one another because you front-loaded your schedules with endless activities for the kids. Maybe it's time to admit that you've allowed the good to overtake the place of the best, and you need to scale back some of those activities. I'm only offering possibilities here, but there is a reality that you must both deal with in order to connect with one another emotionally and live out God's created purposes for your marriage. Here's a third connection question: are there any social media relationships that need to be cut off for you two to prosper in your marriage? You know, a common aspect of many relationships these days that experience high levels of tension is that married folks are reconnecting with ex-girlfriends and ex-boyfriends on Facebook, Instagram, and the like. And if you're one of those people, my question is this: why? What are you gaining by that except having an insecure, suspicious mate? And as a married person, is that dopamine rush worth it for what you get out of reliving your sophomore year in high school? You ought to simply cut all that off and give your spouse full access to all your passwords, to your devices, and social media accounts. Having a secure, connected spouse is well worth it. The fourth connection question is this: how often do you initiate the romantic talks in your relationship? There's a lot of topics that we cover in life: the kids' grades, the checking accounts, what the weather's supposed to be like tomorrow, and those all have some level of importance as we converse with each other. But if you have somehow morphed into little more than roommates, why not work on stoking the romantic flames again with some great conversation about your love life together? The next question is a very vital one. Would you say that sexual intimacy in your relationship is constant and healthy? You see, God speaks of marriage in terms of unity, and let's stop acting that everything else is okay, but that even though we have a dormant intimate life, that everything's all right. Really, nothing's all right when the intimacy is gone. The bank account can have money in it. You can be saving up money for retirement. The kids can be healthy and caught up on all the things they need to do for school. But if things aren't good in your intimate life, one with another, then things just simply aren't good as a couple. Final connection question is this: do you often share memories together about your first dating days and other milestone moments in your relationship? If the answer is yes here, wonderful. But if the answer here is no, then ask yourselves why, and also what you might have to do to protect your well waters by remembering those wonderful memories as you digged your well together. Bring to mind those love notes, those enchanting first dates, your wedding day, and so on. Remember, these are moments very unique to you that no one else shares, and so enjoy them again and again together. In doing so, you'll be enjoying your well waters and not looking for waters outside of your well. Let's look at the teal section at the bottom of page 2, where we see assignments to be completed between now and the next lesson. The first one is this. Without consulting your spouse, list 2 funny experiences you've had with your spouse. List 2 sad experiences. List 2 tense experiences. List 2 comforting experiences. Let both spouses write them down on a sheet of paper or make a note for this on a note-taking app on your phone. Compare your list with that of your spouse. Did you list the same events? Doing this activity would make a great date night event. Next, ponder each child's personality. Try to describe in only 10 words how your unsteady marriage is or could be affecting each child. If you do not have an answer to this, create a teachable moment this week with each child or discuss it possibly at the dinner table. To preserve the honor due to the parents, please don't ask, "What do you think would happen if I leave your terrible, no good mother?" No, don't say those words. Consider casually asking, "Do you have any classmates who only live with a mom or a dad? Do they talk about it much? Do they want their mother to return to the home?" Rely on the Holy Spirit to give you the questions to ask in order to determine the depth of your child's heart. The third part of your homework assignment is this. Without consulting your spouse, list 2 or 3 factors of life or people in your life who are either competing with or interfering with your marriage without mutual consent. Consult with your spouse to discern how these factors or people might be removed or at least limited in their contact with your marriage. Now please turn over to page 3 and we'll look at the rest of the assignments. Fourthly, without consulting your spouse, list 2 or 3 ways in which you think that you could be his or her sanctuary. Compare your lists with your spouse. Are you creating a comforting environment for your spouse in the same way that he or she needs it? Ask yourself that question. The next part of your homework is a vital one. Set a time aside in which you and your spouse will meet this week alone for at least 20 minutes to discuss your sexually intimate life. Make this appointment with your spouse and let nothing deter it. Before the appointment, ponder how you think you are meeting his or her physically intimate needs and pray for wisdom to allow you to see how to meet your spouse's needs when he or she shares with you those needs in this area. And your final homework assignment before we meet up again next week is this. As you are made aware of your faults, be quick to confess them to your spouse. And as your spouse asks for your forgiveness for their faults, continue last week's assignment of forgiving one another immediately. You know, I'm encouraged that you would have taken this time to get together with me for the second lesson. As always, it would be my pleasure to hear from you on Facebook or through email. Y'all have a great week connecting with God and with one another for your marriage.